Every morning at 5 a.m., Grace prayed for God to save her dying family. She begged him to expose whatever was destroying her marriage, draining their finances, and tearing her children apart. But there was one thing Grace never imagined. The person saying Amen beside her was the same person hiding the truth. And when God finally answered Grace's prayer, the betrayal didn't come from an enemy. It came from her own sister. Every morning at exactly 5 a.m., Grace Williams prayed for God to save her family. Before the sun rose over their quiet neighborhood outside Atlanta, before her children stirred in their rooms, and before her husband reached for his phone to begin another stressful day, Grace would kneel beside her bed with her Bible open in front of her. Some mornings, she prayed confidently. Other mornings, she could barely speak through her tears. Lord, I don't understand what is happening to us, but please don't let my family fall apart. For 17 years, Grace had believed she and her husband, Marcus, had built the kind of marriage that could survive almost anything. They weren't wealthy, they weren't perfect, but they had faith. They had 3 beautiful children. They had a church community that loved them. And after years of saving, Marcus had finally opened a small construction company that was beginning to provide the kind of stability they had always dreamed about. Then everything started changing. At first, it was little things. Marcus became unusually quiet. He started coming home later. He would sit in the driveway for several minutes before entering the house, staring through the windshield as though he needed to prepare himself before facing his family. Grace noticed, of course she noticed. A wife knows when the atmosphere around her husband changes. Whenever she asked what was wrong, Marcus gave her the same answer: business. Grace wanted to believe him. Then the bills started arriving. One overdue notice became three became seven. Their mortgage payment was suddenly late. Grace's debit card was declined at the grocery store with nearly $200 worth of food sitting in her cart. She stood there embarrassed as strangers waited behind her. That evening she confronted Marcus. "What is happening to our money?" Marcus wouldn't look at her. "Going through a difficult season." "A difficult season doesn't empty our account without me knowing. I'll fix it." "How?" "Grace, please." That word ended the conversation, please. It became Marcus's favorite word whenever Grace got too close to whatever he wasn't telling her. But money wasn't the only thing disappearing from their home. Peace disappeared too. Their oldest son, 19-year-old Jordan, began arguing constantly with his father. One night the argument became so heated that Jordan packed a bag and left. Grace stood at the front door screaming his name as his car disappeared down the street. He didn't return the next morning, or the morning after that. For weeks, he barely answered Grace's calls. Their younger children began spending more time in their bedrooms. Dinner became quiet. Marcus became distant. And Grace began wondering whether the family she had spent 17 years building was collapsing right in front of her. That was when she started waking at 5 every morning to pray. At first, she prayed alone. Then her younger sister Rebecca found out. Rebecca Carter was 4 years younger than Grace and had always been more than a sister. She was Grace's best friend. When their mother died, Rebecca had been the person Grace called whenever grief became unbearable. When Grace gave birth to her youngest daughter, Rebecca spent almost 2 weeks at the house helping with meals and laundry. The children called her Aunt Becca. Marcus treated her like family. Marcus treated her like family. There had never been a reason not to trust her. So when Rebecca discovered how badly things were going, she immediately stepped in. "You shouldn't be carrying this alone," she told Grace. And Grace believed her. Rebecca started visiting more often. She brought groceries. She occasionally gave Grace money. When Grace cried, Rebecca listened. And sometimes before sunrise, Rebecca would drive across town just to kneel beside her sister and pray. Those mornings became precious to Grace. 2 sisters kneeling together, 2 Bibles open, 2 voices asking God for the same miracle, or at least Grace thought they were asking for the same thing. "God, restore this family," Grace would pray. "Amen," Rebecca whispered. "Expose anything being hidden from me." Rebecca's voice would become softer. "Amen. Whatever is happening that I cannot see, Lord, bring it into the light." Rebecca would squeeze Grace's hand and say nothing. Grace never questioned it. Why would she? This was her sister. The woman she trusted enough to enter her home without knocking. The woman who knew the code to their alarm. The woman her children trusted. The woman who sometimes sat beside Grace in church and lifted both hands during worship. But there was something Grace didn't know. Rebecca knew exactly why Marcus had become distant. She knew why money was disappearing. She knew why certain bills weren't being paid. And she knew why Marcus could barely look his wife in the eyes, because Rebecca and Marcus shared a secret that had been growing for months. One Sunday evening, that secret almost revealed itself. Grace had returned home exhausted after church. Marcus was outside in the backyard speaking with their youngest son. His phone was charging on the kitchen counter. Grace was preparing dinner when it suddenly began vibrating. She glanced toward it, then froze. The caller was Rebecca. Grace smiled at first. There was nothing unusual about her sister calling, except Rebecca had spoken to Grace less than an hour earlier. She had specifically said she was traveling and probably wouldn't have good reception until Monday. Grace reached for Marcus's phone. She wasn't suspicious yet, she simply assumed Rebecca needed something. She answered. "Hey, Becca." Silence. Grace waited. "Hello?" Nothing. Then she heard breathing. Grace looked at the screen to make sure the call was still connected. "Rebecca." The call ended. Grace stood completely still. A strange feeling moved through her stomach. She called Rebecca back from Marcus's phone. No answer. She tried again. No answer. Then Grace picked up her own phone and called. Rebecca answered almost immediately. "Hey, sis." Grace's expression changed. "Did you just call Marcus?" There was a pause, only a second, but Grace noticed it. "Yeah, I was trying to ask him something about the house." "About the house?" Another pause. "I can't remember. I'll call you later. I'm about to drive." The call ended. Grace slowly lowered her phone. Something didn't feel right. Marcus walked into the kitchen a few minutes later. He saw his phone in Grace's hand and stopped. That was the moment everything changed. Grace hadn't accused him of anything. She hadn't even spoken. But Marcus's face had already answered a question she hadn't asked. "Rebecca called you," Grace said. Marcus looked toward the phone. "'Kay." She hung up when I answered. Reached for a bottle of water. She probably called by mistake. "She told me she wanted to ask you something about the house." Marcus stopped opening the bottle. Grace watched him. "What did she want to ask?" "I don't know. She says she called you intentionally. You say it was probably a mistake." Finally looked at his wife. "Grace, I'm tired. Can we not do this tonight?" There it was again, avoidance. Grace felt something inside her shift. For months she had been asking God to show her what was happening. For months she had believed the problem was financial. For months she had defended Marcus whenever friends suggested something deeper might be wrong. And now her husband couldn't answer a simple question about her sister. That night, Grace barely slept. Marcus lay beside her, breathing heavily. At 4:52 a.m., Grace quietly climbed out of bed. 8 minutes earlier than usual she knelt. But this time her prayer was different. "God, if there's something I need to know, show me." Her voice trembled. "Even if it hurts." Grace didn't know that upstairs, inside Marcus's briefcase, there was a folder containing bank documents she had never seen. She didn't know Rebecca's name appeared on several of them. And she certainly didn't know that one document carried something even more disturbing: Grace's signature. Except Grace had never signed it. 3 days later she found the folder. Marcus had left for work early. Grace was cleaning their bedroom when she noticed his briefcase partially open beside the dresser. Normally she wouldn't touch it, but an envelope was sticking out. Across the top were the words, "Final payment notice." Grace pulled it out. The amount made her stomach drop. $48,700. She read the page twice. Then she saw Rebecca's full name. Grace sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands began trembling. There were more documents underneath. Loan agreements, bank statements, transfer confirmations. Money had been moving from Marcus's business account to an account connected to Rebecca. Thousands of dollars again and again and again. Then Grace found the document with her signature. She stared at it. No, she knew her handwriting. That wasn't hers. Someone had signed her name. Grace immediately grabbed her phone and called Marcus. No answer. She called again. Nothing. Then she called Rebecca. Rebecca answered. "Hey, sis." Grace didn't return the greeting. She simply asked, "Why is your name on documents inside my husband's briefcase?" Silence. Grace stood. Rebecca, still nothing. Then her sister whispered something Grace would never forget. "Where did you find those?" Grace felt the room spinning. "Not what documents? Not. I don't know what you're talking about." Rebecca knew exactly what Grace had found. Grace looked down at the papers scattered across her bed, her marriage, her finances. Her sister, everything suddenly felt connected. "What did you do?" Rebecca started crying. "Grace, please let me explain." Grace's heart pounded. "Then explain." "I never meant for it to go this far." Grace closed her eyes. Those words terrified her more than any confession could have. Because whatever Rebecca had done wasn't an accident. It had started somewhere. It had continued. And Marcus knew about it. Then Rebecca said, "Marcus was only trying to protect you." Grace opened her eyes. "Protect me." From what before Rebecca could explain, Grace heard the front door downstairs open. Marcus was home hours earlier than expected. Grace slowly turned toward the bedroom door. She could hear his footsteps climbing the stairs. Rebecca was still crying through the phone. And suddenly Grace realized something. Marcus hadn't simply forgotten his briefcase. Someone had told him Grace had found it. The bedroom door opened. Marcus stood there. His eyes moved from Grace to the phone, and finally to the documents covering their bed. Nobody spoke. Grace held up the paper carrying her forged signature. "Tell me what you and my sister did." Marcus's face went pale, and the answer he was about to give would force Grace to question everything she thought she knew about the two people she trusted most. But even then, Grace still didn't know the entire truth, because the missing money was only the beginning. Marcus stood in the bedroom doorway, staring at the documents covering the bed. Grace held up the paper carrying her forged signature. "Tell me what you and my sister did." Marcus slowly entered the room. Grace put the papers down. "Don't tell me what to do." Her voice shook. "Why is Rebecca receiving money from your company?" Marcus lowered his eyes. Grace's heart sank. "How much have you given her?" "It's complicated." "No, it's money. Give me a number." Remained silent. "Marcus, almost $70,000. Grace stared at him. 70,000. Her knees weakened. "That was our children's college money." "I know. Our savings." Marcus nodded. Grace covered her mouth. "And my signature." Marcus looked away. Rebecca was desperate. Grace's expression hardened. "That wasn't my question." Finally looked at her. "I signed it." Grace stopped breathing for a moment. "You forged my signature. I thought I could replace the money before you discovered it." Grace laughed bitterly. "Discovered it?" She pointed toward the documents. "You make it sound like you borrowed $20 from my purse." Stepped closer. "Rebecca came to me 8 months ago. She owed people money." "What people?" She had started a business. Grace frowned. Rebecca had told her the business was doing well. Marcus continued. "She borrowed heavily. When everything collapsed, she couldn't repay the loans. So you gave her our money. At first I loaned her 5,000. Then she needed more." Stared at him in disbelief. "I was trying to keep everything from falling apart." "You were helping it fall apart." Filled the room. Then Grace remembered something. Jordan, the arguments, the anger, the night her son left. Grace slowly looked at Marcus. "Did Jordan know?" Marcus didn't answer. Her stomach tightened. "Marcus, did our son know?" He found one of the transfers. Grace stepped backward. "That was why you two were fighting." Marcus nodded. "He wanted to tell you." Grace felt tears filling her eyes. "And you stopped him." "I asked him to give me time." "You made me believe my son abandoned this family." "I didn't mean." "For weeks I cried over that boy." Grace grabbed her phone. She called Jordan once, twice. On the third attempt he answered. "Mom." Grace could barely speak. "Jordan, did you know about Aunt Rebecca?" There was a long silence. Then Jordan whispered, "Dad finally told you." Grace closed her eyes. Her own son had known. Long, a few months. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because Dad begged me not to." Grace looked at Marcus. Jordan continued. "Mom, there's something Dad still hasn't told you." Grace's eyes opened. Marcus immediately moved toward her. "Jordan, don't." Grace stepped away from him. "What hasn't he told me?" "Mom, listen to me." Jordan's voice became serious. "The money isn't the reason I left." Grace's heart began pounding. "Then why did you leave?" Another silence. When Jordan finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "Because I heard Dad and Aunt Rebecca arguing one night." Marcus went pale. Grace tightened her grip on the phone. "Arguing about what?" Jordan hesitated. Then he said, "About you." Grace looked directly at her husband. Marcus shook his head. "Grace, hang up the phone." She ignored him. "What did they say, Jordan?" "I didn't hear everything." Jordan paused. "Aunt Rebecca said something I'll never forget." Grace's breathing became shallow. "What?" Jordan answered. "She told Dad that if you ever discovered what really happened, you would never forgive either of them." slowly lowered herself onto the bed. The $70,000, the forged signature, the lies, suddenly they felt like only pieces of something much bigger. She looked at Marcus. What really happened? Marcus didn't answer. Grace stood again. This time there were no tears. 17 years, Marcus, 3 children, I deserve the truth. Looked toward the floor, then he whispered. The money didn't start with Rebecca's business. Grace froze. Marcus swallowed. It started with your mother's house. Grace stared at him. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. And the house Marcus was talking about had been sold shortly after her death. Grace had always believed the money from that sale had been divided equally between her and Rebecca. Apparently, it hadn't. And suddenly Grace understood why Rebecca had been so desperate to keep certain things hidden. The betrayal had started long before the missing $70,000, long before Marcus became distant, long before Jordan left home, and perhaps even long before Grace began praying for God to expose the truth. Grace stared at Marcus. What about my mother's house? Marcus sat on the edge of the bed. After your mother died, the house sold for more than you were told. Grace frowned. What do you mean? Rebecca handled most of the paperwork. She told you the house sold for $180,000. Yes. It sold for $260,000. Grace went still. $80,000. Where did the rest go? Marcus lowered his head. Rebecca kept it. Grace stared at him. And you knew? Not at first. Then when, 2 years ago, Rebecca told me after her business started failing. Grace felt sick. For 2 years, Marcus had known her own sister had stolen part of their inheritance. You protected her. She begged me not to destroy your relationship. Grace laughed bitterly. Instead, you helped her destroy my family. Marcus had no answer. Grace grabbed her keys. Where are you going? To hear it from her. Less than 30 minutes later, Grace was standing outside Rebecca's house. Rebecca opened the door with swollen eyes. Grace, did you steal money from our mother's house? Rebecca began crying. That was enough. Grace stepped inside. You prayed with me. I know. You held my hands and asked God to expose what was destroying my family. I know. While you knew the truth, Rebecca covered her face. I was ashamed. Grace's voice broke. You watched me struggle to buy groceries. I wanted to repay everything. With money from my husband's company, Rebecca nodded. Grace finally understood. Marcus hadn't originally been giving Rebecca money to save her business. He had been helping her replace the inheritance she had stolen. Then Rebecca whispered, "There's something else." Grace stared at her. What else could there possibly be? Rebecca wiped her tears. Mom knew. Grace froze. What? Before she died, she changed what she wanted done with the house. Grace shook her head. Mom told us everything would be divided equally. She changed her mind. Why? Rebecca looked terrified. Because she discovered something about Marcus. Grace's heart dropped. What did my mother discover? Rebecca hesitated. Then Grace's phone rang. Marcus. She ignored it. It rang again. Rebecca looked at the phone. You should answer him. Grace's eyes remained on her sister. Why? Rebecca whispered. Because your mother made him promise never to tell you. Suddenly, Grace realized the secret surrounding her mother's house wasn't really about money. It was about her husband. Grace finally answered the phone. What did my mother know? Marcus was silent. Marcus, I'm done with secrets. Lowered her head, then Marcus spoke. Your mother discovered I had taken money from the business years ago. Grace frowned. What business? Your father's construction company. Grace froze. Before her father died, Marcus had worked for him. Marcus continued. I was struggling. Our house was almost in foreclosure. You were pregnant with Jordan. So you stole from my father. I borrowed it without permission. $25,000. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. Did you pay it back? Eventually, every dollar. Then why didn't Mom tell me? Because she knew what it would do to our marriage. Grace looked at Rebecca. And the house? Rebecca wiped her eyes, changed her will. She wanted part of the house money used to repay what Marcus had taken. But he said he already repaid it, nodded slowly. He did. Grace's eyes narrowed. Then where is that money? Rebecca began crying again. I took it. Grace went silent. Rebecca had used the confusion surrounding their mother's instructions to keep the extra money for herself. And when Marcus discovered the truth years later, Rebecca threatened to expose what he had done to Grace's father if he told Grace about the inheritance. Grace finally understood everything. Marcus wasn't having an affair. He was being blackmailed by her sister. And instead of telling his wife the truth, he had emptied their savings trying to buy Rebecca's silence. Grace ended the call. She stared at Rebecca. "You didn't just steal money," cried Harder. "You used my husband's worst mistake to control him." I was scared. "Every morning you prayed with me." Couldn't answer. Grace walked toward the door. "Grace, please." Grace stopped for a moment. Rebecca expected her sister to turn around. She didn't. "I need you to stay away from my family." Then Grace left. That evening she returned home. Marcus was sitting alone in the living room. He stood when she entered. "Tonight?" She walked upstairs. At 5 a.m. the following morning, Grace's alarm sounded. She stared at it. For months that sound had meant prayer, but that morning Grace turned it off. She couldn't pray. Her husband had lied. Her sister had betrayed her. Her son had left because of secrets that should never have existed. Grace sat beside the bed and looked at her Bible. For the first time in years, she didn't open it. Days passed. Grace stopped attending church. She stopped answering Rebecca, and she barely spoke to Marcus. Then one morning, Grace woke at 4:57 a.m. No alarm. She stared into the darkness. 3 minutes later, she slowly climbed out of bed. Grace knelt, but she had no beautiful prayer left, no scriptures, no declarations, only tears. Finally, she whispered, "God, I don't know what to pray anymore." She covered her face. "I'm angry, I'm hurt, and I don't know who to trust." Grace began crying. Then she said the words that would change the direction of her life. "Please don't let what they did to me change who I am." For the first time since discovering the truth, Grace wasn't asking God to fix Marcus. She wasn't asking him to punish Rebecca. She wasn't even asking for the money back. She was asking God to protect her heart. And that morning, Grace finally understood. Sometimes the first answer to prayer isn't restoration. Sometimes it's truth. 3 weeks passed. Grace didn't suddenly feel healed, but she started praying again, not for everything to return to the way it was. She prayed for wisdom, for courage, and for the strength to make the right decisions. Then one Saturday morning, the doorbell rang. Grace opened the door. Jordan stood there with a backpack. Grace covered her mouth. "Jordan." She pulled her son into her arms. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Jordan whispered, "I'm sorry I left." Shook her head. "No. I'm sorry you were carrying secrets that belong to adults." Appeared behind them. Father and son stared at each other. "I failed you," Marcus said. Jordan's expression softened. "You failed Mom." Nodded. "I know." That evening, Grace finally sat across from her husband. Marcus didn't make excuses. "I should have told you everything." "Yes, I was ashamed." "Your mistake wasn't only what happened years ago, Marcus. It was choosing another lie every time you had the opportunity to tell me the truth." Lowered his head. "Can you forgive me?" Grace was quiet. "I can forgive you." Looked up hopefully. "Forgiveness doesn't mean everything immediately goes back to normal." Grace insisted they attend marriage counseling. Marcus agreed. He also began rebuilding the children's savings from his own income. But Rebecca faced a different consequence. Grace hired an attorney. Rebecca agreed to repay every dollar she had taken from their mother's estate. For months, the sisters didn't speak. Then one Sunday, Grace returned to church. Marcus sat beside her. Jordan sat on her other side. When the pastor invited everyone to pray, Grace closed her eyes. She remembered those mornings when Rebecca had knelt beside her saying, "Amen." For a moment the pain returned. Then Grace heard someone crying behind her. She turned. Rebecca stood several rows back. Their eyes met. Rebecca didn't approach. She simply mouthed, "I'm sorry," looked away. She wasn't ready to restore the relationship, but something inside her had changed. She no longer needed revenge. Months passed. Marcus remained in counseling. Jordan returned home and enrolled in college. The younger children slowly became themselves again, and Rebecca kept making repayments. One morning, almost a year after everything began, Grace woke before her alarm. 4:58 a.m. She smiled. Then she knelt beside her bed. Her Bible was open again. Marcus quietly knelt beside her. Grace took his hand. "Lord, thank you." Looked at her. Grace continued. "Because everything happened the way I wanted." Filled her eyes. "Because when I asked you to save my family, you first showed me what was destroying it." Squeezed her hand. Grace finally understood the prayer she had prayed all those months ago. She had asked God to expose whatever was hidden. She simply hadn't expected the answer to hurt so much. Her family wasn't perfect. Her marriage still required healing. Her relationship with Rebecca still needed time, but the secrets were gone. And sometimes God doesn't answer prayer by immediately removing the storm. Sometimes he turns on the light. Grace looked down at her Bible. For 17 years, she had believed faith meant trusting God to keep painful things from happening. Now she understood something deeper. Faith was trusting him even after they did. And the truth that nearly destroyed Grace's family became the truth that finally gave them a chance to heal. Because sometimes the prayer that hurts when God answers it is the very prayer that sets you free. 1 year later, Grace still woke before 5 a.m., but now, she no longer knelt beside her bed asking God to expose secrets. She prayed with gratitude. Marcus had kept his promise. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but counseling had taught them to replace secrecy with honesty. Jordan was doing well in college, and laughter had slowly returned to their home. Rebecca had repaid most of the money, but repairing what she had broken with Grace took much longer. Then one Sunday after church, Grace found Rebecca waiting outside. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "I don't expect things to ever be the same." Grace looked at her sister. "They won't be," lowered her head, then Grace gently took her hand. "That doesn't mean God can't build something new." Began crying. This time Grace hugged her. It wasn't forgetting. It wasn't pretending the betrayal hadn't happened. It was forgiveness. That night, Grace opened the same Bible that had been beside her during the darkest season of her life. Marcus sat quietly beside her. Grace smiled. She had once prayed for God to save her family. She thought the answer would be God keeping everything together. Instead, God exposed what was tearing them apart. And Grace finally understood, some prayers don't change your circumstances first. They change what you can finally see. And sometimes, the truth God brings into the light may break your heart before it sets you free. Grace stands outside her home at sunrise, peaceful and emotionally healed, holding her Bible against her chest. Marcus and their children are softly visible near the house behind her, suggesting that the family is healing without implying everything is suddenly perfect. Warm morning light breaks through the clouds. Grace has a small, grateful smile and slightly emotional eyes. The overall feeling is peace after a storm, forgiveness, truth, and restored faith. Sometimes God, ANSWRSWITH, the truth keep the faith. Keep praying. Subscribe for more faith stories.